Silent as a shadow, as restless as the driving rain, the hunters of Huanchi prowl the territories of Talaxis in search of trespassers. In this video, we're going to be showing you how to paint the Hunters of Huanchi warband, and we're going to be focusing on two models. First one will be Huanchi's Claw, and the second will be the Terror Wing. And by following this guide, you'll easily be able to paint up the rest of the warband too. Now, the first thing we need to do is undercoat the models, and to do this, we've chosen to use Grey Seer for Huanchi's Claw and Chaos Black for the Terror Wing. Now, the first thing we're going to do is base coat the skin of Huanchi's Claw, and for this we're going to use Gut Ripper Flesh. So, let's take some Gut Ripper Flesh onto the palette. We're not thinning it down, but we are just going to put it on the palette to control how much is on our brush. Then roll your brush to a point, and we're going to carefully just pick out the skin of the model. Don't worry too much about being neat at this point, as we'll be painting over the rest of the model soon anyway. And with the skin done, we're going to move on to the rest of our base coats. So we're going to start off with Stegodon Scale Green for areas like the blades and the scales. Then we're going to pick out all the metallics with Skull Crusher Brass, and then some of the bone areas with Wraithbone. So let's get some Stegodon Scale Green onto the palette. Thin it down with some water. There we go. Then we're going to pick out the blades and also all the scales on the model. You'll probably want to do a few coats of this. There's also some areas of the shield to pick out. If you're not sure which, just refer back to the box art. Now that we've picked out all those details, we're going to move on to the metallics, and for this we're going to use Skull Crusher Brass. This is a layer paint, but it's exactly the colour that we want, so you might just need to do a few layers. And now that all the metallics are picked out, we're going to use Wraithbone to paint the helmet here. So as you can see here, we've actually left the horns unpainted, as we'll be painting those in a moment. And we've used Wraithbone to pick out the helmet and also this fern here on the base. With that done, we're going to move on to the next stages. So we're going to use Rhinox Hide to pick out those weapon shafts and those horns we talked about. Then we're moving on to some other details using Steel Legion Drab, Bugman's Glow and Gal Vorback Red. So let's get some Rhinox Hide onto the palette. Thin it down with some water. A little bit more. Then make sure you've got a good point on that brush, and we're going to use that to pick out those horns and also the weapon shafts. With the dark brown areas done, we're now going to use Steel Legion Drab to pick out the lighter brown pouches. Now we've used Steel Legion Drab to pick out the pouches and also that tabard there, we're going to use Bugman's Glow on the tongue. The next thing we're going to do is use Gal Vorback Red to paint all the straps and ropes on the model. Just take your time with this and be as neat as you can. Don't worry if you make any mistakes, you can just tidy back up with the previous colours. And now that all the base coats are applied, we're going to move on to our shades and contrasts. And these are going to be Agrax Earthshade, thinned down with Lamia Medium. Then we'll move on to Croak Green, Drakenhof Nightshade, Agrax Earthshade again, and then finishing off with Caraborg Crimson. So let's get 1 part Lamia Medium onto our palette. And then clean off the brush, dry it off, and 1 part Agrax Earthshade. We don't need too much here. Mix that together. Then we're just going to apply that over the helmet of the model. We've thinned it down with Lamia Medium, so it's slightly less pigmented. This creates a more subtle shade on the model. With that shade applied to the helmet and also that fern on the base there, we're now going to apply Croak Green onto the skin. This will just slightly change the colour of the skin and get into those recesses. The next thing we're going to do is apply Drakenhof Nightshade to those darker areas. So this is like the blades and those bits on the shield as well. When we move on to the scales, we're going to be applying a few layers of this. And the reason for this is to build it up and to help blend it into the skin tone. The next thing we're going to do is use Agrax Earthshade straight from the pot on the metallics, wood and the horns. Once that's dry, we're now going to apply Caribou Crimson to the tongue. And with the miniature painted, we're now going to move on to the base. So for this, we're going to apply a technical paint called Armageddon Dunes. Then we're going to shade that down with Agrax Earthshade. So with the large end of the Citadel texture tool, we're going to scoop some out there and just carefully apply that onto the base of the miniature. You can use the smaller end of the tool to carefully push it around the feet of the model. This will take around an hour to fully dry. Now that's dry, we're going to apply Agrax Earthshade all over the top. This will just help to get into the recesses and create some depth. And with that done, the last thing to do is to paint the rim of the base in a colour that matches the rest of the warband. In this case, we've used Steel Legion Drab. Next, we're going to move on to painting the terror wing. For this, we're going to start off with some base coats, and this will be using Abaddon Black, Jakera Orange, Skull Crusher Brass, Bugman's Glow, Wraithbone, and Mechanicus Standard Grey. So let's get some Abaddon Black onto the palette. A little bit more. I'm going to thin this down quite a lot. A little bit more. There we go. Then we're going to apply that all over the terror wing. The reason for doing this is that Abaddon Black has a slightly different finish to the Chaos Black undercoat, and if we need to tidy up any of those black areas later, this will just really help us out with that. With the initial base coat done, we're now going to use Jakero Orange on the scales. Just take your time and be as neat as you can. But if you do make any mistakes, you can easily tidy back up with Abaddon Black. You'll probably need to apply a couple of coats of this. With the scales done, we're now going to use Skull Crusher Brass to pick out the metallic areas. With the metallic areas picked out, we're now going to use Bugman's Glow for the tongue and the mouth, as well as the fins. Next, we're going to use Wraithbone for the claws and the eyes. You'll notice at the back of the stonework there's also a skull, and we need to pick this out in Wraithbone as well. With all the claws and the eyes picked out, we're now going to move on to the stone pillar at the bottom, and for this we're just going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey. And now our base coats are done, we're going to move on to our shades and contrasts. These are going to be Gryph-hound Orange, Agrax Earthshade and Caribou Crimson. So we're going to get some Gryph-hound Orange. We're going to just put it on the palette so we can control how much is on our brush. Then we're going to apply that all over the orange areas, so all over those scales. Be careful not to overload your brush when you're using contrast. If you do find it pooling too much in the recesses, just clean off your brush and use it to soak up the excess. Next, we're going to use Agrax Earthshade over the scales, the fins, the metallics and the eyes. Putting this on the scales helps to soften the transition between the brown and the black. And the last shade we're going to use is Caribou Crimson on the tongue and the mouth. And with all that done, we're now going to move on to some final details. So to paint the stripes on the wings, we're going to use Wild Rider Red followed by Fire Dragon Bright. Then we'll dot the eyes with Abaddon Black. So let's get some Wild Rider Red onto the palette. Now we want to thin this down with quite a lot of water as we want it to be nice and thin. A little bit more. Then make sure you've not got too much paint on your brush. And we're going to start on this wing over here. When we're doing this, we're going to start at the top of the wing and work our way down. We don't need to worry about the lines being straight as we want them to look quite natural. Once we've established the line with the first coat, we're going to go back and do a second one. This time it's going to be a little bit thicker. This is just to help it blend in with the black better. So as you can see, the thinner layers of the paint on the edges with the black blend in really nicely, and now we're going to use Fire Dragon Bright to paint a thin line down the middle of each stripe. Now the stripes are done, we're going to use Abaddon Black to dot the eye. Again, make sure you've thinned the paint down for this and keep a nice fine point on that brush. And all that's left to do is base the miniature, and for this we've done it exactly the same way that we based Huanchi's claw. After that, you just need to paint the base rim in a colour that matches the rest of your army. Now our hunters of Huanchi are ready to face any who dare corrupt the domain of the Old Ones. The hunters riddle them with deadly toxin-laced darts, leaving them helpless to defend against the warband's killing strikes. So there's just a couple of things to remember when you're painting this miniature. When using contrast paint, work in small sections on the miniature. This stops the paint from drying out too quickly and creates a consistent finish across the miniature. Also, after you've finished using metallic paints, it's a good idea to change your paint water. This will stop any metallic flakes getting into those non-metallic paints. Well, that's the end of the video. We hope you've enjoyed watching and we hope you have great fun painting your own miniatures. We'll see you in the next one. Bye!